Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into something that doesn't scream for your attention, but rather mumbles from underneath the dirt. Ever thought about how someone in the Middle Ages might have died, only to wake up to darkness, silence, and about 20 pounds of soil on their chest? It wasn't uncommon, and no, that's not just a spooky story, it was a logistical problem. You might not realize this, but before doctors had clipboards and heart monitors, they had a guess. A really sleepy guess. And once you were dead enough, that was it. People moved fast, especially when disease was involved. That still body could be you, taking a nap with shallow breath. But back then, nobody was waiting around to find out. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop your location and local time down below. I love knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward through a medieval village, the air thick with a smell that's somewhere between old bread and wet dogs. Only worse. Life here is short, sharp, and extremely not sanitary. If you fall sick, you don't get antibiotics, you get prayers and maybe a damp cloth if someone likes you. Now imagine falling into a deep faint or slipping into a cataleptic episode, something that mimics death. Your breath is shallow, your skin pale, your limbs cold. There's no twitch to signal life, no beeping monitor. People around you begin to mourn, not because they're cruel, but because they've seen death before, and you look the part. You lie there, quiet as a stone, and someone whispers to fetch the parish priest. Someone else mentions the carpenter, and in the hours that follow, you don't move. You can't, but you're still here, inside, a passenger in your own stiffened shell. You might hear the murmurs, feel the touch of rough fingers arranging your arms, smell the beeswax candles, or maybe it's just blankness, until it's not, until it's too late. It's easy now to joke about the living dead, but back then, the line between the two wasn't a line at all. It was a fog. Most people weren't diagnosed dead. They were assumed, and not always maliciously, sometimes sincerely. You don't have a doctor with tools. You have a local woman with calloused hands and some folk wisdom passed down from a grandmother who once treated gout with hot vinegar and prayer. In cases of sudden death, or what appeared to be especially in plague years, the pressure to bury quickly was immense. Not just cultural, but religious. The soul had to be respected. The body couldn't linger. But when you rush something as serious as death, the mistakes follow with shovel in hand. Historians still argue whether the number of premature burials was widespread or anecdotal, but the clues left behind in parish records, folklore, and even exhumed graves tell a bone-chilling story. Like the old tale of the grocer's wife in Bristol, found buried with a broken nail and torn fingertips after a local flood unearthed her coffin, or the preserved Hungarian noblewoman whose corpse showed signs of shifted position and a face frozen in a silent scream. These aren't ghost stories, they're anatomical puzzles, because while we might comfort ourselves by imagining it was just gas, just natural movement, there's always that sick possibility. What if they woke up? What if you do? And the thing is, you wouldn't even have to be completely still. Some people weren't even fully unconscious, just too weak to signal. A fever might drop your pulse to a whisper, your breath to a ghost. No mirrors fogging up, no fingers twitching, just the slow sink into what looks like eternity. And once that wooden lid comes down, you're on your own. Unless someone notices, unless someone listens. But the odds aren't great, especially when you're not a lord or lady, just another muddy boot in the village. You're not getting embalmed. You're not getting a medical check. You're getting a box. Sometimes just a sheet and a hole. In winter, the ground's too hard. They'll pile stones. In summer, the stink urges haste. You see, burial in medieval times was part sacred rite, part municipal chore. There's no funeral parlor, no embalmer with gloves, just neighbors with shovels. And the rhythm of it all, washing the body, sewing the shroud, digging the grave, becomes mechanical. You, lying still, becomes scenery. Grief makes people slow, but fear makes them fast, and nothing stirs fear like pestilence. The moment you stop moving, People are already calculating how to dispose of you before you leak. As one monk rather colorfully put it in his diary, "You're gone before your spirit realizes it." A quirky little tidbit: in parts of medieval Germany, people believed that a dead person who lay too long above ground could become restless in the afterlife, so some parishes enforced a strict 24-hour burial deadline, even if the corpse was questionable. So if you fell into one of those pesky 2-day comas, tough luck. You were a scheduling problem. Now you're a local legend. The truth is, most people didn't die in a blaze of dramatic final words. They slipped away, or seemed to, and when you're surrounded by the sounds of livestock, candlelight, and whispered prayers, no one's leaning in to check for a heartbeat that science hadn't even described properly yet. The heart was believed to be the seat of emotion, not a circulatory engine. Breathing was visible, death was defined visually. And so ironically, it was the unseen that killed you. Not your illness, but the absence of certainty. There's something uniquely terrifying in the idea of dying wrong. Not the pain of it, but the mistake. The sleep that isn't sleep. The death that isn't death. And even now, in the gentle quiet of your room, you can almost feel it that slow, cold dread as your fingers twitch beneath the linen. And no one notices that moment you inhale not to breathe, but to scream, and the dirt presses down with a soft, final weight. You lie in the earth, barely conscious, and something soft brushes your finger. It's not a worm or a root, it's a thread, thin, frail, and tied delicately to your cold, unresponsive hand. Follow that thread upward, and it disappears into the wooden lid above you, continues past the nail heads, and emerges into daylight, where it's attached to a small metal bell. It's not decorative. It's not symbolic. It's a desperate little device born from centuries of collective anxiety, the safety coffin. And in this moment, that bell might be your last lifeline. Literally. Of course, in your current condition, you can't ring it. Not yet. But someone out there had the foresight, or perhaps the paranoia, to prepare for the possibility that death, in this case, might be a false alarm. And that's the paradox, isn't it? They buried you because they thought you were dead, but also tied a bell to your finger, just in case you weren't. This, in essence, is medieval logic. Practical, slightly superstitious, and occasionally life-saving, assuming someone's listening when the bell rings. The idea of the safety coffin didn't come fully formed. It evolved, like most historical stopgaps, from trial, error, and good old-fashioned dread. The early versions were crude wooden boxes with air holes, ropes connected to flags, or in the rarest instances, even breathing tubes leading above ground. But the bell-on-a-string version that became the iconic symbol of this silent fear, and it wasn't just a medieval curiosity, it persisted well into the 18th and 19th centuries, showing just how deeply the terror of premature burial lodged itself in the Western psyche. You might laugh now at the thought of a little bell dinging gently in a graveyard breeze, but imagine being the one underground, pulling with all your might, your breath thin and your fingernails breaking against wood. It's not so funny when you're the punchline. What's fascinating and disturbing is that these safety measures were often installed after someone had already been buried alive. Discovered too late, nothing sparks invention like post-mortem regret. Grave diggers in Bavaria once found a coffin lid scratched from the inside, the body twisted unnaturally, the hands bloodied from clawing. That image haunted the village enough that, within a year, they started using string bell systems for burials. Historians still argue whether these safety coffins were used frequently or only for the wealthy and eccentric, but the fact that they existed at all speaks volumes about cultural anxiety. The living feared ghosts, but they feared being mistaken for one even more. And it wasn't just paranoia, it was backed by a string of unsettling cases. One of the most famous early adopters of safety coffins was Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, who insisted his coffin be fitted with a lock, a key, an air tube, and even a small feeding system, in case he woke up with an appetite. Did he know something others didn't, or had he just seen enough mistakes to distrust the system entirely? You have to admire the man's commitment to survival, even after being declared dead. Here's a quirk for you in some English cemeteries during the 1800s. Waiting mortuaries were built a kind of death lounge, where bodies would be left on display for several days just to make absolutely sure the guest of honor wasn't going to sit up and ask for tea. Attendants took shifts watching for signs of twitching, Sometimes they used mirrors or feathers placed by the mouth to detect breath. Other times, they simply waited and waited until decay gave them confidence. But back in the earlier centuries, especially in the Middle Ages, such patience was rare. You couldn't afford to wait. Decomposition was considered spiritually dangerous. A body left too long might attract spirits, or worse, judgment. So, if you're lying in that box with your string and bell, you're already lucky. Most coffins weren't equipped with anything, and the graveyard was not a place of quiet rest. It was noisy with rumor and religious fear. If your bell rang and someone heard it, would they believe it was you or a devil playing tricks? That's not hyperbole. It's documented that in some regions, any disturbance from a grave was interpreted as demonic. So even if you rang your bell, help might not come. Or if it did, it would arrive with holy water and a stake. The irony? The very mechanism designed to save you could be the reason you stayed buried. Because once people were told to expect signs of movement from the grave, they started interpreting everything as spiritual warning. A shifting grave marker, the wind, a bell ringing, the devil, a groan. Definitely not your cousin waking up, probably a ghost. You become less of a person and more of a symbol, of fear, of death mismanaged, of nature behaving unnaturally. You're not Tom the blacksmith anymore. You're the cursed one, the restless one. Now let's talk about who actually got a safety coffin, because surprise, you probably didn't. If you were poor, your burial was quick, dirty, and utterly devoid of bells. The privilege of being unsure about your death, that belonged to the wealthy. To afford a safety mechanism, you had to afford a coffin, a plot, a craftsman, and the metal for the bell. Most of the population got a shallow trench, a winding sheet, and a prayer. If you twitched under the dirt, you twitched alone. But if you had money, you could request special arrangements, sometimes even hire a watchman to monitor the grave for several days. Not for thieves, for you, just in case. There's something poetic and deeply tragic about the idea that someone might spend their final fortune ensuring they didn't have a final ending. A little bell, tied to a trembling finger, that no one might hear, or worse, that someone hears but chooses to ignore. Because they're tired, because it's late, because they don't believe in second chances. That, more than anything, was the risk, not death itself, but the possibility of being almost dead and dismissed. And you wonder now, lying still and quiet in your bed, what it must feel like to pull that string. Not with strength, but with sheer panic. The thread trembling between life and death. Your pulse returning just enough to want air, your body stiff, but your mind screaming. And above, a tiny bell sways in the wind. Was that a bird? Was that movement? Someone wonders. Someone shrugs. Someone walks away. You can smell it before you see it, the stench of bodies, both dead and almost dead, carried through the narrow medieval alleys like a foul wind. The year is 1348, and you're living or trying to in a world cracking under the weight of the Black Death. There are no doctors in crisp coats, no emergency rooms, no hazmat suits, just villagers with cloths over their mouths, carting wheelbarrows full of limp limbs to hurriedly dug trenches. You're coughing, feverish, your skin mottled with patches. People glance once, then look away, already assuming your time has come. And maybe it has, but maybe it hasn't. The trouble is, no one has time to find out. The plague doesn't negotiate, it devours, and in its shadow, even a single cough becomes a death sentence. People are dying faster than priests can bless, faster than grave diggers can dig, and you might still be breathing when the sheet goes over your face. Because when the village is losing dozens a day, nobody's waiting to see if your chest rises a second time. The Black Death, historians agree, killed somewhere between 30% to 60% of Europe's population. That number is big enough to feel abstract until you place yourself in the middle of it. Imagine your town of 500 people. Now imagine 300 of them gone in a season. The baker, the priest, your neighbor's children, everyone, gone. The panic is not theoretical, it's everywhere. You see it in the eyes of the midwives, the silence of the church bells, the hurried way people wash hands in wine and call it divine protection. When the body count climbs, fear overrides ritual, burial becomes a necessity, not a ceremony. The dead and those who only seem to be are bundled and buried together. There's no time for wakes, no time to check pulses. You're not seen as a person anymore. You're a contagion in cloth. You collapse in your home, breath shallow, lips blue. To your mother, it looks like death. To your brother, it's already too late. They've seen too many people slump like this and never come back. You're not moving, so they act out of fear, out of love, out of desperate, exhausted logic. They cover your body, say a few tearful prayers, and call for the men with the cart. You're hauled through streets now, muddy with blood and rain, your body jostled between others. You try to cry out, but your voice is a whisper trapped inside a failing throat. The bell doesn't ring. There is no bell. A strange historical quirk here, some regions during the plague adopted what they called plague pits, mass graves, where bodies were piled layer by layer, sprinkled with quicklime and dirt in between. These pits were meant to reduce the spread of disease, but they also ensured no one could crawl out, even if they weren't quite dead yet. Historians still argue whether the speed of burial was driven more by public health or public panic, but either way, the result was the same. You were buried fast, and often prematurely. In Italy, accounts from city officials during the worst years describe servants tossing bodies into pits, while prayers were mumbled in bulk, like factory settings. One notary wrote of seeing a man begin to stir just as he was about to be dropped in. The man begged for water. The workers, unsure if it was real or a devil's voice, threw him in anyway and covered him with the next corpse. That story made it into local folklore, not as a cautionary tale, but as a proof of the plague's cruelty. No one blamed the diggers, who had time for doubt. The paradox of plague burial was this: the more afraid people were of the disease, the more likely they were to bury someone who might still be alive. But the more they buried prematurely, the more terrified others became of falling ill, not just of dying, but of dying wrong. Suddenly, being misdiagnosed wasn't just a possibility, it was a probability. Entire cities passed ordinances allowing burials within hours of death-like symptoms. The logic was sound by medieval standards. Delay meant danger, but it also meant death for those unlucky enough to suffer a seizure, fainting spell, or cataleptic episode. You think of the scholars debating it centuries later, arguing in dry language about what percentage of burials might have been premature. But in that moment, in that wagon, it's not academic. You're awake, you're aware, and you're buried beneath two other bodies before the first handful of dirt hits your face. There's another layer to this religion. The church had firm beliefs about burial and the soul. The body was sacred, and so was the timing. Delayed burial was seen as improper, even dangerous for the spirit. A body left above ground was vulnerable to corruption, not just physical, but spiritual. Demons, it was believed, could possess an unburied corpse, so there was pressure, spiritual and social, to get people in the ground quickly. Ironically, this pressure to honor the soul sometimes doomed the body. You were buried to protect your afterlife, even if your current life hadn't quite ended. In some places, plague victims weren't even granted individual graves. They were burned, not out of cruelty, but caution. Fire purified, but fire also silenced. If you weren't dead before the flames reached you, you were shortly after. There's no coming back from a funeral pyre lit in haste. It's easy to say now that we would have done better, that we would have checked twice, but panic flattens nuance. And medieval panic, it was a tidal wave. And in that wave, you were a number, a liability, a threat. Not because people hated you, but because they couldn't afford to love you too long. Love slowed things down. Love required time, and time, in the shadow of plague, was the one thing nobody had. Maybe you wake up, maybe not. But if you do, it's not to morning bird song. It's to silence, suffocating, still silence. Your mouth opens to scream, but there's no room, no air. The dead press against you like clay. Their silence becomes yours, and the world above it keeps turning. The carts roll on, the bells toll again. Another body, another grave, another breath you'll never take. You wake up to cloth over your eyes, the sour stink of incense and sweat still clinging to your skin, and the distant sound of dirt being shoveled. You don't know where you are. Not at first. There's a numbness in your limbs that feels like sleep, until the realization creeps in. Slow as frostbite? No. You're not asleep. You're somewhere enclosed. Your chest rises barely. The air is stale, thick, borrowed. You try to speak, but your tongue is dry as dust. What you remember last is lying in bed, fevered and still, and then the priest's voice murmuring something about the soul's journey. But you weren't dead. Not then. And you're not now. The only question is how long before they finish covering you. The answer depends on who was watching and what they believed they saw. In the medieval world, clerics held immense authority over life and death. It wasn't just about last rites or burial blessings. They were often the ones to pronounce death itself. And, to be fair, they weren't trained in medicine. Most relied on the signs passed down through theology and folk tradition. No breath, no movement, a certain coldness. That was enough. You weren't declared dead with instruments, you were declared dead with confidence. But confidence doesn't mean accuracy. And as you're slowly buried by mistake, you realize the terrible truth: the people handling your body think they're doing a sacred duty. They think they're sending your soul onward, when in fact, they're sentencing you to one of the worst deaths imaginable. Even today, scholars debate how many medieval death pronouncements were flat out wrong. Some argue it was rare and unlucky fluke. Others suggest it was more common than we want to believe, especially during outbreaks of disease or mass casualty events. The truth, as always, lies somewhere murky in between. But we know these clerics weren't just spiritual figures. In many villages, they were the default authority for everything from health to heresy. And when one of them looked over your still body and nodded solemnly, that was it. No one questioned it. To question the priest was to question God's will. You were dead because the man in robes said so. And let's not forget the coffins themselves, if you were lucky enough to get one. These weren't plush caskets with satin linings and cushions. They were crude wooden boxes, often reused if you weren't nobility. That's right, reused. In poor parishes, they'd use a communal coffin to wheel your body to the grave, then slide you out of it into the dirt. Why waste good wood? And if you were being buried in winter, they might leave your body in a frozen chamber until the earth softened, sometimes weeks. If you weren't actually dead, that waiting room was your last chance. But not all clerics were careless. Some took their time. There were those who insisted on watching the body for signs: tiny twitches, sighs, anything at all. That's where the tradition of the wake comes in. Holding vigil wasn't just about mourning. It was also about making sure sitting by the body with candles and prayers gave the still alive a chance to reawaken. It was a ritual of love, but also insurance, a final pause before sealing fate. The problem was, not every family had the time or the means. During plagues or war, or when a village was overwhelmed, even these rituals were rushed. You could be lying there, silently pleading for breath, while the man beside you chanted psalms and reached for his holy water. Here's a strange fringe tidbit some clerics used to place bread on a body's chest to test for death. If the loaf didn't rise and fall with breath, the soul had left. One monk even described placing a candle near the nose. If the flame didn't flicker, it was over. Of course, these methods weren't reliable, but they gave the illusion of certainty, and that illusion was often enough. So imagine now you're in a church, lying on a cold stone slab. The priest sprinkles you with holy water. He murmurs Latin over you, absolving sins you haven't finished committing. The acolyte sews your mouth shut. Yes, that was a real practice, to keep the body dignified. Your jaw slackens in sleep, and they think it's death. The stitching is clumsy, the needle thick, you twitch, no one notices, or they do, but call it the death shudder. Your fingers curl slightly, post-mortem contraction. They'll say, someone's lighting candles. Someone else is closing the lid. Historians still argue whether people were genuinely this oblivious, or whether the ritual simply numbed them to the risk. But consider this for many medieval villagers. Death was routine, not abstract, not romantic. It happened often, publicly, and without much ceremony. They buried children, neighbors, lovers. After a while, You stop seeing the details. You move on autopilot. The mistake, then, wasn't apathy. It was fatigue. Emotional, spiritual, and physical. And the clerics most meant well. They believed they were guiding souls home, not burying the breathing. They trusted signs handed down by centuries of tradition, but those signs weren't foolproof. They relied on sight and smell, not science. And so, every now and then, they got it wrong. And when they did, it wasn't just a misdiagnosis. It was a death sentence, performed with ritual, delivered with prayer. There's a dark irony to it all. The very people meant to protect your passage into the afterlife might be the ones who accidentally ensured you didn't finish your time on earth. And not out of cruelty, out of faith, out of reverence. You weren't treated carelessly. You were treated sacredly, just prematurely. So here you are again, in the dark, your limbs stiff, your breath thin. You were almost saved by the wake, but not quite. You were almost noticed by the priest, but his eyes were closed in prayer. You were almost alive enough to stop this, but now the lid is closed. The hymns are over. The soil is falling. And above ground, the bell tower rings once, then twice. Another soul has moved on. They think, they just don't know it hasn't yet. The candles have gone out. The prayers have ended. And you're alone. You're not buried yet. Not quite. They've dressed you in your best wool. A rough shroud tied with thin twine at the ankles and wrists. Your body lies in a wooden box, open to view. And a few people still mill around you in the room. They whisper and sip watered ale. This is the wake, a peculiar pause between life and burial. And while it seems like a moment for grief, for stories, and for few slightly inappropriate jokes about your past, its true purpose is stranger, older, and more unsettling. They're watching you, not for comfort, but for motion, for proof. Because centuries before, long before anyone trusted the finality of death, people learned that some corpses didn't stay corpses. Some twitched, some breathed, and a few sat up. So tonight, while they weep, they also wait. They wait to make sure you don't come back. You feel nothing at first, except a kind of float, like sinking into tepid water. Somewhere inside, a whisper of consciousness stirs. Your ears catch a murmur, a laugh, a clink of cup to table. Someone drops a spoon. The shroud over your eyes is thin enough that a little light still reaches you, warm and golden. You don't know what this is, dream or death, but your body remains still. Too still. The shroud holds you like sleep paralysis, and yet, slowly, your fingertips curl. Not enough to be seen, just enough to remind you that you're still in here, that you're not a memory yet. The tradition of the wake stretches back to ancient times, but in medieval Europe, it took on a deeply practical tone. Sure, people mourned. They told stories, shared bread, wept into cloth, but they also watched. The body would be laid out, sometimes for a full day or two, in the main room of the house. Candles circled the corpse. Mirrors were often covered not just out of respect, but because of superstition that the soul might be reflected and trapped. In this atmosphere of fear and familiarity, people sat in shifts, drinking lightly, dozing, but always keeping one eye open. You weren't considered properly dead until you stayed still for long enough. One reason the wake became standard was precisely because of the mistakes we've been whispering about. There are records murky, but persistent, of people waking during these vigils. Not often, but enough to rattle the culture. A sudden gasp, a cough, even a sneeze. Imagine the reaction, candlelight flickering, someone leaning forward to brush a hair from your brow, and your eyes open. Some faint, some scream. Some believe it's a miracle. Some believe it's the devil. You're back, but whether you're welcomed depends on who's watching. Historians still debate whether the primary function of the wake was spiritual, social, or medical. Some argue it was a communal goodbye. Others say it was a chance to fend off hauntings if you sent someone to the grave too soon. They might return, angry. Still others point out the obvious: if you lie in a coma for a few hours, you just might wake up before the lid goes on. And if you do, well, thank the wake. It bought you time. the rarest and most valuable commodity of the medieval era. Of course, not all wakes were equal. If you were rich, your wake might last for days. A dozen candles, psalms read by rotation, gentle music, people in embroidered robes pausing between readings of scripture to glance at your chest, just in case it rose again. But if you were poor, you might get a few hours, maybe one candle, maybe none, maybe just your cousin, already half drunk, leaning against the doorframe and humming to himself while you lie motionless on the table. It's not malice, it's just life. Busy, dirty, indifferent life. And in those hours, your chance to survive your own death hinges on the attention span of people with jobs to do. One quirky detail in some regions: families placed a bowl of milk or water near the corpse, supposedly to absorb lingering spirit energy. If the water rippled, they said, the soul was restless or the body still alive. A superstition? Yes, but one rooted in the fear that silence might deceive them. People also placed coins over the eyes, not just to pay the ferryman across the river Styx, but to keep the eyelids from fluttering open during the wake. Because if that happened, everyone would panic. Even now, centuries later, people tell ghost stories that begin with his eyes opened at the wake. The fear wasn't entirely irrational. Medical conditions like catalepsy, epilepsy, and diabetic comas weren't understood at all. A person could go rigid, unresponsive, barely breathing, and then recover hours later. In a world without stethoscopes or blood pressure cuffs, the human body was a mystery box, and sometimes it played cruel tricks. You lay on a table surrounded by weeping relatives, and all your body needs is rest, but the crowd thinks it's your exit. That's what the wake was meant to guard against. Not death, but mistake. Still, as useful as it was, the wake wasn't foolproof. Sometimes the watchers got tired, sometimes they drank too much, sometimes the body stayed still just long enough to fool them. And then, the next morning, the carpenters arrived. The box was closed. The prayers resumed. You were still, after all, still and silent. And they assumed silence meant departure. So now, here you are. The candle wax has burned low. One ant snores quietly in a chair. Someone's dog is curled beneath the table. You feel your jaw twitch. You want to move, want to speak, but your throat is dry, your chest heavy. The longer you wait, the harder it becomes. Your chance is slipping. One more hour and the men with hammers will arrive. They'll seal you in, thinking they're honoring your journey, thinking they're finishing the ritual, but they're starting a different one. The one where you awaken to darkness, where you scratch, claw, and cry in silence. You wonder if anyone has noticed that slight movement in your hand, the tremble of a toe. Probably not, or they did, but chalked it up to a nerve spasm. They'll say, the body still twitches after death. They'll tell each other not to worry, that it's normal, that it happens, but you know the truth. You're not done yet. You're not gone, not even close. The rain comes down in sheets, soaking through the cloaks of the gravediggers as they shuffle through mud slick as soap. You're not awake yet, but you're not gone either. You lie in your coffin, no longer watched, no longer surrounded by whispering family or candlelight. Now it's just you, the wooden box, and the pit. The men above you are not priests or doctors. They are workers, wet and tired, with dirt under their fingernails, and no interest in the finer details of your final breath. The grave is not 6 feet deep, it's barely 3, hacked together in haste because the churchyard is crowded and the ground is soft. The rain makes everything worse. The soil collapses inward as they dig, turning the whole task into a race between nature and necessity. There's no time to make it neat, no time to second guess. You're going in, ready or not. Contrary to popular belief, 6-foot graves weren't standard in the Middle Ages. That depth came later, with plague regulations in 17th century London. Before that, especially in smaller European villages, graves were often shallow 2 to 4 feet deep. If that were such soil quality, season, and urgency all played a role. In winter, graves might be barely scratched into frozen earth. In summer, rot came fast, and speed mattered more than depth. You, right now, are being lowered into a muddy trench more like a garden bed than a tomb. The box wobbles as it settles, the wood groaning as it shifts. One gravedigger mutters about the rain, another spits into the grass, and just like that, the shoveling begins. There's something brutal about how quickly the earth closes over you. Each wet scoop slaps the lid, a muffled thud that echoes in your ears. You're still unconscious, still curled in that faint half-dream, but somewhere inside your body, something stirs. Your fingers twitch, your toes shift, your lungs tighten against the stale air. But up above, the men are nearly finished. They don't look for signs. They don't check for movement. Their job is to bury, not to worry. Historians still argue whether grave depth was a reflection of local custom, practicality, or superstition. Some say shallow graves were a matter of efficiency. More people meant more bodies, and space was finite. Others suggest it was tied to fears of resurrection or haunting buried deep enough, and the dead can't rise. Ironically, these shallow burials made it far more likely that someone still alive would be heard, if anyone were listening. But no one is. Not in the rain, not in a churchyard already crowded with 100 others. You're packed in now, mud pressing around the box, the pressure growing with every shovelful. You wake slowly, groggily, confused. It's dark, so dark, and silent, except for a distant tapping. Then it hits you the air, or rather, the lack of it. You open your mouth to breathe and taste wood, damp, cold, splintered. You try to move your hands, but they're crossed, pinned by the shroud. You try to scream, but it comes out like a gasp. Your chest rises and the box presses back. You are alive, and you are buried. You're not the first. There are records of exhumed coffins where claw marks were found on the inside of the lid, fingernail scratches, blood smears, bodies twisted into positions inconsistent with peaceful death. One case in France described a skeleton whose skull had been turned 180 degrees within the box explained away as soil shift. But you can imagine otherwise. You can imagine someone waking, panicking, thrashing, twisting, screaming with no sound. The silence of the grave broken only by the desperate, useless resistance of one more mistaken burial. One particularly chilling account comes from 14th century Bohemia, where a noblewoman believed dead from fever was buried in haste. Days later, her tomb was reopened for religious reasons, and her body was found face down, fingers broken, mouth open in a frozen scream. The priest who oversaw the burial swore she had not moved. The villagers whispered that she had been taken by spirits, but a few quietly admitted they had seen her twitch. They just didn't want to say anything. A quirky tidbit. In some German towns, gravediggers were paid extra for double-checking a practice that meant giving the body a final poke or slap before burial. Not for disrespect, but as a crude test of vitality. A foot jabbed with a spade, a sharp knock on the ribs. If the corpse didn't respond, it went into the ground. It was called the last test, but not all towns paid for it, and many workers skipped it altogether in bad weather, like today. You shift again. It's getting harder to breathe now. The box was never airtight, but it's close. Your breath fogs the lid above you, a useless gesture in a coffin that doesn't care. You try again to cry out, your voice cracking in your throat. You slam your shoulder against the wood. Nothing, no answer, just the crushing silence of dirt on wood on flesh. The men above are gone now. The grave looks no different from the others. A small wooden marker, hastily etched with your name, leans against a stone. No one suspects a thing. To them, you were sick. You died. You were buried. The rhythm of death continues, one mistake at a time. And that's the cruel pattern of it all. Burial was a system, a fast, essential, sometimes careless system. It wasn't designed for exceptions. If you didn't speak up in time, you were assumed to be gone. No one waited for you to whisper. No one paused for a second breath. You were only alive as long as people believed it. And the moment they didn't, the moment they needed your grave more than your pulse, you were gone. Now, inside this shallow grave, the weight of the earth begins to press against the box. Moisture seeps through the cracks. You gasp. Once. Again. Your fists clench, tear through the shroud. You scratch at the lid, nails snapping against the splinters. You kick, you arch your back, you scream until your throat burns, but the dirt smothers the sound. Your body thrashes as if to prove its life, but no one is watching anymore. The rain has stopped, the priest has left, the grave is quiet, and in the stillness, your movements slow. The panic fades to exhaustion. The lack of air wraps itself around you like a second shroud. Your heartbeat thuds, weak and slow. You lie back, your lungs flutter, the claw marks stop, you rest. Not because you want to, because you have to, because your second chance was missed by inches, and the world, so busy with the business of death, never knew it had left one life behind. Somewhere in the village, a bell tolls, not the little one tied to a desperate fingertip, but the large one in the chapel tower, swung by hand, announcing another soul's departure, but you don't hear it. Not now. Not through the layers of damp soil and splintered wood pressing against your ears. You lie motionless, a silence within silence, a pause inside the symphony of the dead. Above you, life continues. The gravediggers walk home, muddy boots squelching. The priest returns to his chambers, muttering prayers. Someone bakes bread, someone sharpens a blade, and no one, not one person, checks twice, not because they are cruel, but because they believe their part is done. No one expects the dead to object, especially not in this age, where death is a routine chore, and graves are dug like furrows for crops, and the men who dig them, those gravediggers, are rarely saints, rarely scholars. They're just tired. In medieval times, gravediggers were essential, but not exactly respected. They were seen as necessary workers, but too close to death for comfort. Often poor, often illiterate. They worked long hours in unsanitary conditions. Their job was simple: dig, bury, repeat. And when the bodies piled up during plague years, during wars, during famines, their work became more frantic. They weren't paid to ask questions. They weren't paid to check pulses. And in many places, they were paid by the body. That meant speed was rewarded, not accuracy. If they buried 20 that week, they got 20 coins. No bonuses for second guesses, no pause for conscience. The system was built on assumptions. The priest says you're dead. The family nods. The box is nailed shut. The grave is dug. What's to question? Gravediggers rarely even saw the faces of those they buried. By the time the bodies reached them, they were wrapped in shrouds or locked in coffins. Their job was disposal, efficient, quick, and invisible. And in that kind of rhythm, one breath too faint, one twitch too soft, is just another oversight. You become part of the scenery, less a person, more a package. But not every burial was quiet. Not every grave remained still. Stories filtered through villages, whispered in taverns, and muttered over fences of coffins that rocked, of cries heard at dusk, of newly turned graves that shifted. These weren't ghost stories. They were warnings. Even the grave diggers, hardened as they were, sometimes paused. One account from 15th century Belgium tells of a worker who heard tapping from below, only to be fired the next day for delaying the burial schedule. His replacement finished the job in silence. The coffin, they said, had just been settling. You wonder now what kind of man buries another without checking. But then again, what choice do they have when death is everywhere? You can't afford luxury. And certainty, real certainty, is a luxury. So the workers dig and drop and cover and walk away, trusting that someone else checked first. But often, no one did. The priest only glimpsed your face. The family only watched from a distance. And by the time you were in the hands of the diggers, you were assumed gone. Your life depended on the attention span of strangers, on the muscle memory of men with shovels. Here's a grim little detail in some towns. Gravediggers worked in shifts round-the-clock teams to keep up with the dying. They worked by torchlight at night, coughing through smoke, often drinking heavily to numb the smell. Mistakes were inevitable, and sometimes they knew. They knew that someone in the box might not be fully dead, but they buried them anyway, because the risk of infection, of delay, of questions, outweighed the guilt. Better to bury a live man one digger reportedly said, than to let a dead one rise. Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerations or bitter truths, but the accounts remain. In church records, in family diaries, in the margins of sermons. In one English parish, a young woman was said to have woken mid-burial, her screams muffled, her fists pounding against the lid. The gravediggers heard and ran, not to save her, but because they thought she was cursed. By the time the priest returned, she was silent again. Her nails were embedded in the wood, her eyes wide. They sealed the coffin and said a second prayer, this time with more crosses drawn in the air. And yet, not all gravediggers were indifferent. A few carried sticks to prod the chest of a corpse, just in case. Others would delay a burial by a few minutes if they saw something strange. A twitch, a tear, a moan. But those were the exceptions. Most did what they were told, what they were paid for. The body goes in, the dirt goes on, the marker is placed, and the next one waits. Now, buried beneath the work of their hands, you lie still. Your fingernails are cracked, your lips are blue, but you are not gone, not fully. The last breath still lingers, shallow, stubborn. Your legs ache with the need to move. Your chest feels like it's collapsing inward. You slam your fist upward once more, a dull thud against the lid. No one hears. The earth absorbs it. Like every mistake they've made before, it vanishes into the dirt. And above, the world forgets you. Your name etched crudely on wood. Your memory fading from the minds of friends already distracted by other deaths. The gravediggers have finished their day. They wipe their hands, count their pay, and drink themselves to sleep. They won't remember you. They never knew you. You were a task, a number, a box in a trench. And the sad truth is, if you had stirred, if you had screamed, if you had banged loud enough, they still might not have helped. Or worse, they might have buried you faster, just to be safe. Your mind floats between worlds now, between sleep and panic, between the slow forgetting of death and the desperate clinging of life. Inside the coffin, breath has become a privilege, not a given. Each inhale scrapes like rust down your throat, and your limbs, though cramping, twitch with a kind of stubborn revolt. The box creaks when you shift, a sound too subtle, too smothered, to reach anyone beyond the soil above. Time begins to blur. Minutes feel like hours. Or maybe it's already been hours. Maybe it's been days. You don't know anymore. What you do know is this: you're still alive, and no one knows it. You're the tragic consequence of a mistake no one will admit to making. But what makes it worse, far worse, is that you're not unique. Because this kind of misfortune has a name, even if people don't like to say it. Catalepsy, coma, death-like states that fooled entire generations into sending people to their graves too early. Catalepsy was one of the great mysteries of medieval medicine, if medicine is even the right word. It wasn't understood, not really. Descriptions varied: people who went cold and stiff, who stopped speaking or moving for hours or even days. Their eyes might stay open, their bodies rigid, their pulses faint or imperceptible. And in an age without instruments or vital signs, this wasn't just terrifying, it was fatal. A cataleptic episode was as good as death to a medieval observer. Sometimes they thought it was a seizure, sometimes possession, sometimes punishment from God. But very rarely did they think, we should wait. One of the earliest documented cases comes from 13th century Italy. A merchant's wife who collapsed suddenly, unresponsive, cold to the touch. They kept her in bed for a day, then buried her in the family crypt. 3 days later, when the tomb was opened for another burial, she was found on the floor. The lid of her coffin cracked open from the inside. Her hands were bloodied. The family never spoke of it again. Some say she became a nun. Others say she lost her mind. But the silence that followed that event lasted longer than the scream that never made it out of her throat. Epilepsy, too, was misunderstood. A person might fall in the street, convulsing, foaming at the mouth, then go perfectly still. To an untrained eye, it looked like death. To a priest, it might look like divine punishment. And to a frightened family, it looked like finality. They buried quickly, especially if there was fear the condition might be contagious. You, in this box, Could be suffering, just such an episode slipped into stillness. Fooled everyone. You know your mind is working, flickering behind the fog, but your body refuses, and their judgment was final. Even comas, which today we classify with clinical nuance, were nothing but a medieval riddle. A person who wouldn't wake, wouldn't eat, wouldn't respond. What else could they be but gone? And so the ritual began. Wash the body, pray, dress, bury. Another soul moved on, or so they hoped. Historians still debate whether these conditions were widely recognized or simply dismissed. Some texts from the Islamic Golden Age, like the writings of Avicenna, detail states of suspended animation and warn against premature burial. But in much of Europe, such warnings were either unknown or ignored. The church dominated the interpretation of life and death, and with that power came terrible mistakes, rarely questioned, never reversed. You wonder if your hands will move soon. You focus all your will into a single finger, willing it to curl, to twitch, to dig. You think you feel something. You try again. Yes, movement, slow, aching, and useless. Your arms are pinned, your feet bound, your face damp with the breath you cannot escape, and the wood holds firm. You scream soft, weak, a whimper in the tomb. A fringe tidbit here, as strange as it sounds in some medieval courts. A test called cruentation was performed to identify a murderer. They believed that a corpse would bleed if its killer approached. It seems absurd now. But what's notable is this. It implies that the dead weren't entirely dead in the minds of medieval people. They left room for interaction, for signs, for motion, just not the kind of motion that would actually save someone like you. They wanted their corpses to bleed, to point, to reveal truths, but they didn't want them to breathe again. Now picture a cold stone crypt, a noblewoman in a silk gown, mistaken for dead after falling unconscious from poisoned wine, intentional or accidental. No one ever figured out. They sealed her inside a tomb beneath the family chapel, candlelit and weeping. But the mason who returned days later to fix a crack found her body face down, her nails torn to ribbons. The priest said it was the devil's trick, that she must have never died properly, and God claimed her spirit again. He said it, not with shame but with authority. The body was reburied, this time face down. Face down burial was one of the crude medieval safeguards against the restless dead or the not so dead. It was believed that burying someone prone would confuse the soul, or force the body downward if it rose again. Superstition and science mixed freely, and the results were more often tragic than effective. Now back to you. The air is thinner, each breath rattles, shallow and sharp. You kick again, you scream louder, you pray not for salvation, but for someone to hear. But no one does, because no one expects noise from the dead. No one listens for life after the priest has spoken. The silence you're screaming into is centuries deep, a silence that stretches from the farmer buried too soon to the child, mistaken for stillborn to the noblewoman who scratched and gasped in velvet shadows. All of them, like you, buried alive not out of malice, but out of ignorance, fear, and haste. And as your lungs draw one more breath, shallow and slow, you realize that even in modern times with all our machines and knowledge, we still carry the echo of this fear. It lingers in horror stories, in posed tales, in nightmares and unspoken worries. The terror of waking in a coffin is older than medicine, older than reason, and tonight, in this quiet grave, it belongs to you. Your fingernails are cracked, the skin beneath them raw from clawing in darkness, and yet still you fight, dragging blood across the lid of your coffin in lines only worms will ever see. You have no room to move, no light to orient yourself, no time to hope. But you do have instinct, and instinct doesn't care about dignity. It tells you to scratch, to kick, to scream until the last thread of air leaves your chest. What haunts you most is not the pain, not even the coming silence, but the realization that others have done this before. You're not the first to die like this. You're not special, and that somehow is worse, because you've heard the stories, haven't you? Not the bedtime ones, the village ones, the ones that whisper about coffins dug up decades later, split from the inside. The ones where skeletons lie sideways, jaws unhinged, hands curled mid-scream. These aren't legends. These are leftovers. Leftovers of lives misread, mistaken, and sealed too soon. Across Europe, there are documented cases of graves reopened sometimes by accident, sometimes by renovation, and what they found inside did not match the tidy expectations of rest. In 17th century Ireland, during a churchyard expansion, workers unearthed a row of coffins from a century prior. One had its lid pushed upward, nails loosened, wood splintered in a pattern consistent with violent internal pressure. The skeleton inside was not aligned neatly as buried, but crumpled, arm raised toward the head. Scholars dismissed it at first, citing natural decomposition shifts, but local folklore had already claimed it the tale of Eileen the Unready, a woman who fainted during childbirth and was buried within the hour. They say she tried to come back. The coffin says she didn't make it. It's not just one story, it's many. In Bohemia, a series of coffins uncovered in a noble crypt all showed signs of interior struggle. The most disturbing belonged to a young man who died supposedly of fever. His fingernails were embedded into the soft underside of the lid, not dragged across it, but stabbed in. Splinters beneath every nail. The lid had scratches. The lining was shredded. The body was twisted. He didn't go quietly, and neither will you. Even stranger are the cases in which the signs of panic were ignored or explained away. One French parish record tells of a woman found months after burial. Her skeleton collapsed sideways in her box, with the top of the coffin cracked clean across. The priest declared it a miracle the body had tried to rise. He claimed, because her soul was not at peace. He ordered her reburied with special rites, facing a different direction, east instead of west, as if the sun would forgive the mistake that his own hands had helped make. And what about the stories of the undead vampires? Ghouls, revenants, all words for people who didn't stay buried. But peel away the superstition, and what do you find? Fear, not fear of what lies beyond the grave, but fear that the grave might not be the end. Tales of the dead rising were likely born not from fantasy, but from eyewitness accounts of disturbed graves and bodies showing signs of activity, scratch marks, open mouths, blood at the lips, sometimes simply from internal pressure, sometimes from ruptured lungs gasping one last time. But to the villagers of the time, it looked like hunger, looked like evil. So they drove stakes through the hearts, removed heads, buried bodies face down or bound with chains, not to keep the spirits in, but the bodies. Historians still argue whether these vampire burials were religious, cultural, or purely panic-driven, but the archaeological record is clear graves where measures were taken to ensure the dead stayed dead. And these weren't criminals. These weren't witches. Often they were people who had died quickly, mysteriously, or too soon. The suspicion wasn't about who they were, but how they died, or maybe whether they truly had. In Poland, a mass grave from the 1500s was found containing several skeletons with bricks placed in their mouths, an anti-vampire practice meant to starve the undead. One body, a woman in her 30s, showed no signs of disease or violence. She might have simply fainted or slipped into a coma, but when she was buried, the villagers weren't taking chances. They silenced her forever, just in case. And this brings us back to you in your box, screaming into a void no one hears. You've clawed until your fingers bleed. You've kicked until your legs gave out. You've tried to remember your name, your home, the sound of voices, but they're slipping away. All you have now is pain and panic and a final, helpless thrashing that echoes faintly through the damp soil. No one will hear it, but maybe, just maybe, someday, someone will open your grave and see the truth, see the marks, the evidence, the tragedy. Maybe they'll tell your story, like the others. Maybe you'll be one more name whispered as a warning. But will they learn? History says, probably not, because these stories get retold, yes, but not as lessons, as horror, as entertainment. The living don't see these signs and ask, how do we stop this from happening again? They ask, did you hear the one about the woman who woke up in the dark? It becomes myth, Caution fades, and beneath the earth, it happens again. The scratching stops, not because you're at peace, but because your muscles no longer answer your panic. Your throat burns, but makes no sound. You feel your heart slowing, not from acceptance, but from depletion. And as the last of your will flickers, you press one hand softly, once more, against the lid above. It doesn't move. It never did. But still, your fingers leave marks tiny, broken crescents that will outlive your scream, marks that whisper, for centuries to come, that you were here, that you were alive, that someone should have waited. The graveyard is quiet now, wind curling through weeds, brushing against moss-covered stones as though reading the names out loud. But you, still and silent beneath the earth, have already slipped beyond what names can save. Time stretches like wet rope in the dark, and your thoughts unravel. But above, in other towns, other regions, they are trying to solve the problem you've become. You're not the only one. Word has spread, whispers of the dead moving, graves unsettled, coffins groaning. People are uneasy, not because they suspect what really happened, but because they fear what might come next. So some take precautions not against premature burial, no, but against you, against the possibility that you'll claw your way out. And that's where the tomb guards come in, not to protect the dead, but to watch for movement. In parts of Eastern Europe, especially in the 16th and 17th centuries, the fear of the restless corpse reached a fever pitch. Entire communities believed that certain people, those who died suddenly, violently, or under mysterious conditions, might come back. Not metaphorically, literally. They weren't thinking in terms of medical misdiagnosis. They thought in terms of spirits, curses, and corrupted souls. And so, guards were appointed. Their job: watch the graves, listen for sounds, look for shifting dirt, stay up at night beside freshly covered mounds, and wait. Because if anything moved, they needed to act quickly, not to rescue, but to destroy. The first few nights after burial were considered the most dangerous. If the dead were going to rise, it would happen then. In Bulgaria, these watchers were sometimes armed with stakes. In Romania, they carried axes and garlic. And across the Slavic world, these guards were paid not handsomely, but enough to keep vigil, to stay sober, to stay sharp. Their presence was a mix of superstition and insurance. A town might not believe in vampires, but they also didn't want to be the next village with an incident. No one wanted to find hoofprints on graves. No one wanted to hear the stories that traveled from valley to valley, stories of coffins opening from the inside. Historians still argue over the purpose of these guards. Were they merely myth chasers, or did they, on some level, understand that mistakes had been made, that maybe not always, but sometimes the dead weren't entirely dead? It's hard to say. Some guards claim to have witnessed movement. One chronicler in Transylvania wrote about a man who sat up mid-burial, screaming, only to be clubbed down by the horrified villagers before he could explain. They thought he was a monster. The truth, he'd fainted from shock after a brutal injury. Not dead, just delayed. And it wasn't just guards. In some towns, grave bells weren't attached to strings inside the coffin, but outside, rigged instead to tripwires beneath the soil, designed to move if the earth shifted. Again, the assumption wasn't that the buried were alive, but that they might rise unnaturally, that they might not stay buried. The line between folklore and medical failure blurred, and in that confusion, no one thought to ask the right question. What if the body's struggle wasn't a sign of demonic return, but of human error? A strange quirk in medieval superstition, some cultures believed the soul didn't leave the body immediately upon death. It lingered for 3 days, hovering, listening, deciding. That's why the dead were spoken to softly, respectfully, why mirrors were covered, why doors were left open to let the soul escape. But what if that belief, strange as it was, accidentally acknowledged a truth that something human remained, that life might still flicker after the priest walked away? Maybe they were wrong about the soul, but right about the timing. You, in your box, have no idea what time it is. Time has collapsed. Memory has folded into instinct. All you know is that the dirt hasn't moved, that the lid hasn't lifted, that your voice has died before your body, but above you, in another part of the graveyard, someone is watching a fresh grave, a guard, cloaked against the cold, half believing in monsters, half bored, if only he were watching yours. Stories passed down from these guards are strange, contradictory. Some said they saw fingers reach through soil. Others swore they heard cries weak, muffled. One man reported seeing a coffin lid vibrate for minutes before stopping. What did he do? He left. He quit that night. Another claimed he dug someone up after hearing a bell. But when he opened the coffin, the person inside was bloodied and dead. They must have died again, he wrote. As if burial was a cycle, a mistake made twice. That detail stuck. It shows you something deeper, that these people weren't just scared of myths. They were scared of being wrong. They were scared of facing what they might have done. In France, a case emerged where a child was buried and later heard crying underground. The father, convinced his daughter was cursed, refused to open the grave. When it was finally exhumed, the girl's body was found twisted, her fingernails gone, her face contorted. The priest declared it divine judgment. The villagers built a stone cross over the grave to seal the spirit, but no one said the obvious. She wasn't cursed. She was breathing. The guards, the watchers, the bells, they were all responses, not to ghosts, but to guilt. Deep, unspoken guilt that maybe, just maybe, they were burying too quickly, and maybe, if they watched closely enough, they could prevent it, or at least control it. But control didn't mean rescue. It meant elimination. If the dead stirred, it meant stabbing. If the ground moved, it meant reburial with chains. To them, you weren't a person coming back to life. You were something they had to put down. So tonight, in this small corner of history, someone watches a grave not far from yours. He sees nothing, hears nothing, and tomorrow, he'll leave. The payment wasn't much. The night was long, and as far as he's concerned, nothing happened. But your grave, no one watched it, no one heard, no one stopped to wonder. And that's the saddest truth. You didn't need a bell or a prayer. You didn't need garlic or chains. You needed someone willing to look again, to hesitate, to say, wait. But hesitation is rare when people fear what they've buried, and so they hire guards, not to listen for life, but to keep the dead dead. You were buried too early, that much is certain. But if you'd moved, if you'd screamed loud enough to be heard, they might not have saved you. They might have killed you all the same. You dream now, if that's what this is. You drift in a gray tide, weightless, somewhere between breath and its memory. But in the rare moments of lucidity that press like water into your ears, you remember the last sound you made. It wasn't a scream, it was a whimper, weak, cracked, eaten by the wood and the soil, and it wasn't enough. The world above had moved on, but not every grave was horizontal. Not every burial was gentle. Some were walls, not pits. Some were cold stone, not soil. And some of the buried weren't victims of mistake, but intention. In certain corners of the medieval world, people were not just placed beneath the earth. They were entombed alive behind brick and mortar, sealed like secrets in castle walls, monasteries, and dungeons. And while your grave is one of negligence, theirs was deliberate. You can almost feel it rough stone brushing the skin, the echo of a final brick tapped into place. Welcome to the quieter horror of walling in. Throughout medieval Europe, the practice of immurement, literally walling a person up alive, was rare, but real, and it was not a punishment reserved only for criminals. It was sometimes used for penance. A woman in Germany, caught committing adultery, begged to be allowed to die in grace. The church granted her request by sealing her in a chamber within the monastery, a space no larger than a standing coffin. A small opening was left for confession, for bread and water. She lasted 11 days. And this, remember, was mercy by the standards of the time. Sometimes the victims were monks or nuns who had broken sacred vows. Silence, poverty, chastity breach any of these. And if your superior was strict enough, your penance could become permanent. There are records from Cistercian abbeys describing disciplinary procedures that included seclusion unto the end of the flesh, The phrasing is chillingly calm. You imagine a candlelit hallway, a stone cell, a final prayer before the doors closed. No violence, just silence, the kind that never ends. Of course, not all immurements were spiritual. In castles, noble families sometimes punished traitors or rivals with what was known as the dry death. No executioner, no trial, just a small hollow between inner and outer walls, just wide enough for a man to stand. Legend has it that in one Scottish tower, a servant accused of spying was bricked in alive, and the builders were paid extra for their silence. Centuries later, the bones were found upright, jaw agape, fingers curled against stone. Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerated products of folklore, not fact, but the evidence is there. In monasteries across Europe, hidden chambers have been discovered during renovations. Some hold bones, some still smell faintly of human decay, and some are utterly empty, save for scratch marks along the stone, not clawed in rage, but in the repetitive motion of someone who tried, slowly and pointlessly, to carve their way out. Here's a quirk to unsettle you in some places. Being buried alive wasn't just a punishment, it was a form of preservation. It was believed that enclosing a person entirely, without exposure to air or disease, could keep their soul from escaping in a corrupted state. The logic was strange, but consistent. Better to die slowly in purity than quickly in sin. For some, the walls were sanctuaries. For others, tombs. You can imagine both. Now, think of this being sealed vertically. No space to lie down, no room to collapse. You stand as long as your legs can bear you, then you fall, but there's no floor. Just a crooked angle. A slant of stone, your body wedged like a forgotten scroll in a hidden library. You don't even have the luxury of scratching the lid above you. There's no lid, just mortar and silence. One of the most disturbing tales comes from an abandoned convent in northern France. During repairs in the 19th century, workers uncovered a vertical shaft within one of the walls. Inside were human remains, collapsed, as if folded into themselves. Scratches covered the stone. Near the floor, someone had carved a crude cross with a bone. No one knew who it had been. No records mentioned a burial, just a name etched faintly beside the mark, Agnes. She had been erased from the convent's history, but her body remembered. You imagine Agnes now, her breath thick with the lime dust, her fingers raw, her prayers whispered into stone until they became indistinguishable from madness. What did she do? Maybe nothing. Maybe too much. Maybe she only loved the wrong person, or disobeyed the wrong rule, and then she was walled up, not for justice, for silence. In some cultures, immurement took a darker twist. In Eastern Europe and the Balkans, certain bridge legends speak of human sacrifices sealed into the foundations to stabilize the structure. One of the most famous is the tale of the Bridge of Arta, where a builder's wife was buried alive inside the masonry to keep it from collapsing. Whether true or not, the story speaks volumes about a time when life was a commodity spendable in stone. And here you lie, in your coffin, under earth, and you feel a strange kinship with those bricked in. Yours was a mistake, theirs a sentence, but the result is the same. A body buried not because it had stopped living, but because someone else said it should. You both screamed, you both begged, and you both were met with a tap of mortar, the thud of earth, the finality of others' decisions. Some say immurement was the worst punishment because it was death without spectacle. No crowd, no witness, just solitude and time, and the slow erosion of hope. You don't know how long it takes to die like that. No one does. It depends on fear, on the width of the air hole, on whether you scream or stay silent. It depends on how long the body holds out, and how long the mind refuses to give in. And that's where you are now, at the edge of refusal. You haven't accepted death, but death doesn't need your permission. It waits, patiently, and above you, far from your grave. People still build walls, still dig pits, still trust eyes more than breath. They say it's different now, that we've learned, but we haven't. Not really, because even now, in the world of machines and monitors, people are still buried too soon. still misread, still sealed away by mistake or malice. So you lie there, heartbeat slowing, lungs starving, fingers twitching, not knowing whether you'll be remembered or rediscovered or simply rot unseen, not knowing whether your story will be told like Agnes's or whether even your name will vanish. All you can do is keep breathing as long as you can until the last breath finds the wall and stops. You no longer feel your fingertips. The blood has receded from your extremities, withdrawn like a tide from the sand, and your muscles have started to betray you limp where they once resisted, still where they once begged. But your mind, though fogged and bruised by oxygen-starved air, still turns. You wonder if anyone else is down here with you, not in this coffin, but nearby, in the same earth. Others like you, buried not by mistake, not by spiritual overreach, but because their lives were judged unworthy of proper care. The forgotten, the expendable, the poor. This wasn't a misreading of breath. This was efficiency. You weren't presumed dead. You just weren't worth checking. You were dropped into what they called a grave, but what was more accurately a hole, a trench, a pit, and you weren't alone. They buried dozens at a time, especially during plague years, especially if you were nobody. Welcome to the pauper's grave. In cities and towns from London to Lubeck, pauper burials were an economic necessity. There was only so much land, only so many coffins, and when the poor died alone, unloved, or simply unclaimed the church, or the city, or no one at all decided where they'd go, plague pits became common during pandemics, but the logic was older. Throw the bodies together, cover them quickly, say a single prayer, or just don't, and move on. You could be poor, or you could be contagious. Either way, you were going into the pit, a long, narrow trench, layered bodies, lime powder, a few shovels of earth. Repeat. The faster, the better. You might imagine this as medieval chaos, but in fact, it was quite organized. Gravediggers had quotas, pits were marked and tracked in ledgers. Burial officials knew how many could fit. If someone stirred under the cloth, they didn't delay. They assumed it was reflex, or gas, or nonsense. Too late to change course. One body twitching among 40 made no difference, especially not when the rest had already begun to rot. If you were unlucky enough to be alive in that moment, the others around you wouldn't save you, they wouldn't protest. They were dead. And soon, so were you. A record from Siena in 1349 recounts a pit filled with 48 bodies in a single day. One man, a young apprentice named Matteo, was seen convulsing as they placed him in. A priest hesitated, but the digger shrugged, said it was too late. If he's not dead now, he will be by dusk. They shoveled the lime over him. Some say he was the last to die. Others say he screamed all night under the dirt. No one dug him up to check. He was poor. He was replaceable. He was invisible. The same happened in Paris, in Krakow, in York. The poor were buried in clusters, in fields behind the churches, or in designated foul grounds. These places didn't have markers, no names, just numbers. And when the pit filled, they'd cover it with turf and start again beside it. If the ground collapsed later, if bones surfaced after a storm, people looked away, covered them again. Never asked why a skull grinned upward with the dirt in its teeth. You lie now in such a place. You know it. You can feel it. The earth isn't even packed properly. It's loose, shifting. You feel something beside your elbow, a knuckle, perhaps someone else's. There's no wood between you and the next body. No boundary, just cloth, long rotted. You aren't in a coffin. You were never granted one. Just wrapped in a sheet, or maybe nothing at all, and laid atop others, not even in a row, just wherever they could place you. If you twitched when they dropped you in, no one noticed. Or worse, they noticed and looked away. Here's a chilling quirk: some plague pit workers carried small knives, not to injure the bodies, but to poke them once, just to be sure. A chest prod, a cheek slice. If no reaction came, the work continued. These were not healers. They were laborers, overworked and underpaid, who had grown numb to the horror. Sometimes they hummed while they buried, sometimes they joked, and sometimes, late at night, they drank until they couldn't hear the imagined sounds of knocking from beneath the soil. Historians still argue whether the majority of plague pit deaths were natural or if some were preventable. The records are unclear, the victims untraceable, but archaeological digs reveal more than numbers. They reveal bones in unnatural positions, skulls tilted back, jaws wide, arms twisted, children in fetal pose, even when the burial position should have been straight. These aren't just the remains of disease, they're the echoes of confusion, panic, and premature burial. And here you are, sharing that soil, another nameless body in a hole meant for disposal, not remembrance. No one will chisel your name, no one will whisper it. In a few weeks, another layer of bodies may be added, the weight will press down, your movements already weak will stop. If you were ever to scream now, it would be into the cold ribs of the man buried beside you. Even the priests, at times, stopped coming. In some regions, mass burial became so routine that rites were skipped entirely. Holy water cost money, time, risk. You were lowered without a word, not even a final sign of the cross. It was considered enough that you landed in consecrated ground, even if your soul was still tethered to your flesh when the dirt covered your face. There's something especially cruel in dying among the forgotten, not just because no one remembers, but because no one ever saw you clearly to begin with. You were a peasant, a beggar, a servant, one of the many, one of the replaceable. And so, when your breath stilled too long or your body went limp, they didn't wait to see if it came back. They just moved on. You weren't worth the pause. And yet, you think, as your breath becomes more memory than act, that maybe someone will dig this pit again. A new building project, a monastery expansion, a curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, they'll find you. Not as a skeleton lying peacefully, but curled, jaw open, fingernails lodged in a neighbor's bone, and they'll know. This wasn't death. This was mistake. This was haste. This was poverty sealed beneath the earth and called justice. You feel your chest stutter. The last fragments of life flicker at the edge of your ribs. You reach out pointlessly, fingertips brushing against someone else's cloth-wrapped arm. Were they alive too? Did they struggle? Or were they the lucky ones, truly gone before the pit took them? You'll never know. But you wonder, even now, whether it was worse to die here or to have lived a life where such an end was inevitable. Your eyes don't close. They already were, sealed by dirt and cloth, but your thoughts slow, not peacefully, not quietly, just inevitably, because this was never about dying peacefully. It was about being buried without being seen. The earth has claimed you now, swallowed your breath, silenced your twitching, and begun the slow process of forgetting. But death in the medieval world didn't always stay buried, because sometimes, if your grave was shallow, and your coffin poorly made or absent altogether, someone would come looking for you, but not to save you. No, they didn't dig with hope. They dug with purpose, with blades, not rescue ropes, because your body was valuable, not as a life, but as a specimen. And if you were very unlucky, your grave was not your final resting place, but a temporary pause before your second fate dissection. Welcome to the unspoken terror of the body snatchers. In the later medieval period and moving into the Renaissance, medicine was beginning to claw its way into legitimacy. Scholars, physicians, and surgeons, those few permitted to learn, hungered for knowledge about anatomy. But human dissection was taboo, dangerous, and tightly controlled by the church. It was allowed only under rare conditions, usually with the cadavers of executed criminals. And even then, the supply never met the demand. So some students, scholars, and early physicians looked elsewhere, quietly, illegally, and they found a resource more abundant than criminals the recently buried poor. Imagine it. You're laid to rest, not in a crypt, not behind stone walls, but in soft, unguarded soil, no coffin, no markers, no locks, just darkness. And then, one night, footsteps. Quiet at first, the clink of a shovel, the muffled grunt of effort. You've been in the ground for a few days, long enough to be dismissed, not long enough to be unusable. They uncover you quickly, efficiently, often working in pairs. One digs, the other pulls. They don't remove the body carefully. They don't whisper apologies. They haul it out like meat, wrap it in cloth, smuggle it beneath carts or into school basements. And you, who struggled so hard to breathe, are now laid bare on a wooden table under candlelight. Not as a person, as a curiosity. Historians still argue when body snatching truly began. But even in the 14th century, there are reports of graves disturbed, of families returning to mourn only to find the earth torn up and the coffin gone. In Bologna, where anatomy was first taught with formal structure, local rumors told of midnight raids on paupers' graves. The church condemned the practice, but the surgeons were protected quietly, unofficially, because progress required sacrifice, and no one wanted to sacrifice the noble, just the voiceless. You might think, lying underground, that your greatest fear is waking too soon. But what if your horror is only beginning after you die? What if, after all that clawing and gasping, you finally succumb, only to be dragged back into the world by men who don't know your name and don't care to learn it? Your body flayed, organs prodded, bones cracked with curiosity, a learning tool, a lesson, a demonstration. One strange anecdote in 15th century Prague. A university kept a list of preferred bodies traits that made for better dissection subjects. Young, unblemished, no disease of the belly. The records didn't say where they found such bodies, but you can guess. It wasn't hospitals, it was churchyards. Even stranger, some body snatchers weren't outsiders. They were insiders, monks, grave diggers, even priests. Men who had access, who had keys, who could open vaults or lead the curious through back doors under cover of night. A bribe passed, a promise made, and your body becomes a favorite of someone with books and blades. In Paris, rumors spread of hospitals paying poor families to relinquish their dead. Not much. A coin, a promise of burial elsewhere. But often, the grave was never dug. The body went straight to the slab. You can imagine the betrayal. A mother thinking her son was buried behind the chapel, lighting candles in prayer while his remains lay in pieces on a professor's desk. And here you are now, beneath the earth, but not for long. You hear the scrape, you feel the vibration, distant but real. Someone is digging, but not with the panic of rescue. No, this is rhythm. This is skill. The soil shifts, air returns, but it's too late. You are no longer alive. You're meat, and they know it. They find you, your body still pliable, fresh enough. They check for decay. You pass, and you're lifted roughly, quickly. Your mouth opens slightly as the air hits you. One of them flinches, the other laughs. Spirits, he says, and drops a cloth over your face. You are loaded onto a cart. The grave is covered as if nothing happened, and by sunrise, your body is no longer yours. The anatomy theater is cold, stone-walled, faintly echoing with the murmur of Latin and the scratching of quills. Students crowd around the table. Most of them have never touched a real corpse before. They stare, some with reverence, some with unease, a few with fascination so intense it borders on hunger. The physician makes the first incision, muttering about the liver. You do not feel it, not anymore. But you'd scream if you could scream, not from pain, but from violation. To the students, you are a marvel, a model. Note the preservation of muscle tissue. Someone says, observe the lungs. A chalkboard sketches out your insides. They argue over your stomach. One jokes about your teeth. No one asks who you were. No one cares if you had a family, or dreams, or if you fought for one more breath before the dirt closed in. Some of them leave changed. Some leave haunted. One day, they'll become physicians, learned men, praised for saving others, and they will not remember you, not by name, just by texture, by color, by the shape of your bones when stripped of all that once made them yours. Scholars debate whether body snatching helped or harmed the course of medicine. It led to discoveries, yes, but it also led to desecration, theft, trauma, and in rare cases, even murder. When demand outpaced supply, some grave robbers skipped the grave part entirely. They created their own dead. In 16th century Italy, a group of students was caught luring beggars with food and wine, then poisoning them to harvest bodies for dissection. The university denied involvement. The city executed 2 of the students, but no one shut down the anatomy program. After all, someone had to learn. And what did we learn? That the human body is complex. Yes, that science is important, of course, but also this, that desperation, curiosity, and cold practicality often walk hand in hand. That when the powerful need something, the powerless provide it whether they know it or not. So your grave was not your ending. It was your entry into another silence, one without ritual, without reverence. They called it progress, but to you, it was just another dark room, another fate chosen for you by strangers. And in the quiet of that anatomy hall, when the students have left and the torches have burned low, your body lies still, stretched and opened, unwept, unnamed. And for a moment, just a moment, you wonder which was worse, dying buried or dying exposed. The anatomy hall grows quiet now. The students shuffle out into the cold dawn, boots echoing down stone corridors. The physician wipes his hands, drops the scalpel into a basin, and covers what's left of you with a stained sheet. And though your body no longer moves, something inside you aches not with pain, but with the vastness of being seen and yet not known, of being touched, sliced, labeled, and diagrammed without anyone ever whispering your name. But as the door shuts behind them and the room darkens again, your story doesn't end here, because the strange truth about being buried alive, whether by mistake or design, isn't only about the ground. It's about who decides you're dead. And in the medieval world, one of the most powerful hands in that decision belonged to the church. The same hands that offered prayers and forgiveness also swung the censer over coffins that should have remained open. And in their attempts to protect souls, they sometimes condemn bodies to silence far too soon. Medieval burial was governed not just by ritual, but by theology. Death wasn't a moment, it was a passage. A soul moving from one realm to the next. The timing of that passage mattered immensely. If the church said you had passed, then by their authority, you had. And once the rites were performed, that was it. No revisiting, no unburying. The sanctity of the ritual outweighed the messy uncertainty of biology. A twitch, a sigh, a flutter of eyelids. It couldn't be real, because once the soul had been prayed over, it had moved on. To suggest otherwise was to question the divine, and that, in the medieval mindset, was a far more dangerous heresy than mistaking the living for the dead. This rigidity wasn't born from cruelty. In many ways, it was fear. The church feared contamination of the sacred by the profane. The dead had to be buried in consecrated ground, properly blessed, properly timed. Even touching a corpse without clerical supervision was a serious offense. So when someone was declared dead, the pressure to act quickly came from both directions: the physical decay of the body and the spiritual decay of delay. To bury late was to risk the soul wandering. To bury wrong was to risk the soul's rejection. And in that tension between piety and panic, people were rushed underground with only a nod and a muttered prayer. In some regions, church officials even enforced strict time limits on burials. Within 12 hours of death, the body had to be interred. In plague years, that window shrank. Rites were abbreviated, Latin rushed, the body barely cold before the ground swallowed it. And if anyone hesitated, if a mother said, "But I saw her hand move," or a brother cried, "He was just breathing," they were often overruled. "It's grief," the clerics would say. "Your mind plays tricks." And if they insisted too loudly, too stubbornly, they might be accused of clinging to the mortal instead of honoring the eternal. The church believed it was protecting the living and the dead, but in doing so, it also protected itself from blame, from doubt, from the unsettling idea that its rituals might sometimes be premature. After all, how could God allow someone to be buried alive? That would mean error. And error had no place in divine order. So even when signs emerged, scratch marks on a coffin lid, disturbed grave soil, bodies found in impossible positions, these were explained away. Demonic interference, said one monk. The devil mimics life to deceive us. Another theory blamed restless souls who refused to accept their fate. The idea that the burial itself had been the error unspeakable. And yet the signs kept appearing. In cathedral crypts, in country chapels, in private family vaults. In one particularly harrowing case from Spain, a young novitiate was buried after collapsing during Mass. She had a seizure, fell, went still. The priest pronounced her dead on the spot. Hours later, as her coffin sat in the chapel before burial, a cleaner reported hearing tapping from inside, but when he told the abbot, he was scolded for superstition. The funeral continued. 2 decades later, during renovations, the coffin was opened and the body was upside down, her fingernails embedded in her scalp. The abbot's notes did not mention remorse, only a prayer for her soul's belated peace. This wasn't rare. Stories like this run through church history like veins beneath pale skin rarely visible, but always there, and yet they remain footnotes, anecdotes, uncomfortable whispers, because to confront them would be to question the very authority that claimed to speak for the divine. It would mean admitting that faith, in its hurry to sanctify, sometimes suffocated, that certainty, dressed in robes, sometimes buried the uncertain before they had the chance to speak. One fringe detail often overlooked in certain monastic orders. Burial garments were chosen not for the deceased's comfort, obviously, but for symbolism. Robes tied tightly, mouths sewn shut, fingers curled around rosaries too tightly wound. The body had to appear composed, dead enough for heaven, and if it moved, well, that must be a trick. A final twitch, nothing to disturb the service over. Historians continue to debate whether the church's role in premature burials was systemic or situational. Some argue it was rare, the result of isolated ignorance. Others suggest that the pressure to maintain spiritual authority meant overlooking warning signs was not just common, but encouraged. After all, if you started digging up the dead on suspicion, where would it end? Better to bury and believe, better to pray and move on, better not to listen to the scratching. And now, as your memory begins to fade, you think of those prayers, the ones muttered over you in haste. You remember the splash of holy water, the murmured Latin, the incense you barely smelled through your ragged breath. You were supposed to find peace. You were supposed to be welcomed into heaven. But what if heaven wanted you to finish your breath first? What if no one ever asked? The priest meant well. They always do. But he didn't check your pulse. He didn't wait. He performed his duty. He believed what his eyes told him, what tradition told him. He did not expect you to return, and so you didn't. But maybe someone will find you, years from now, under flagstones or behind a chapel wall. Maybe they'll notice your jaw open, your hands torn. Maybe they'll say your name aloud. Maybe, for the first time, someone will listen, not to your prayers, but to your silence. And maybe that's all you ever needed. Your silence stretches now across centuries, tucked beneath layers of soil and superstition. Yet, even so, the grave is never as final as it seems, because while some people were buried alive by mistake, and others by haste, there were those for whom the burial was no accident at all. You were not declared dead too soon. You were not misdiagnosed. You were buried because someone wanted you gone and wanted it to look like fate. In the flickering candlelight of power and revenge, burial became not just a ritual, but a weapon. And though the church had its rules, and medicine had its ignorance, human cruelty always knew how to find loopholes. Some people weren't buried because they were dead. They were buried to make them dead. Imagine it now. You're a courtier in a noble household. You've angered someone, spoken too freely, flirted too boldly, uncovered too much. You fall ill, but not from nature. A bitter drink, a whisper, a hand on your shoulder that lingers a moment too long. Then sleep, then stillness. You wake up, but not in your bed. You're underground, alone, and the realization comes slowly. Like ink seeping across parchment, this wasn't an error. This was elimination. Neat, convenient, and utterly irreversible. After all, no one suspects a thing. You were sick. After all, you fainted. and now you're resting in peace, according to everyone but you. This quiet kind of murder was rare, but not unheard of, in noble courts, where inheritance meant power. The disappearance of a rival needed discretion, a dagger left marks, a poisoned cup could be questioned, but a burial with priests and hymns and family weeping, that was clean, that was tidy. And if the victim happened to have only looked dead, all the better. No crime to confess to, no sin to repent. One chilling example from the 15th century tells of a young noblewoman in Brittany who was engaged to a rival house's heir. The match was political lucrative for some, dangerous for others. She took ill days before the wedding, her body going limp, her breath shallow. The family physician declared her dead within hours. She was buried the next day. With such haste, it raised quiet suspicion, but no one spoke. Years later, when her crypt was opened to bury another family member, her remains were found curled in a position inconsistent with peaceful death. Her mouth gaped open, her nails were gone, her fingers clutched at the velvet lining, but by then, the land had already changed hands. The deed had been done. The grave had kept its secret, until it didn't. In Venice, whispers surrounded the sudden deaths of two brothers who stood to inherit a vast fortune. One was found in bed, pale but warm. The physician was bribed to pronounce him dead immediately. The second collapsed on the palace steps during a banquet. His body was wrapped and buried before the dessert was served. Rumors swirled, but no one dared investigate. When wealth is at stake, corpses become paperwork, and paper doesn't scratch from inside a coffin. Historians still argue over how widespread this was. Some say it was myth, amplified by Gothic imagination. Others suggest it happened more often than we'd like to believe, just cleanly, quietly, efficiently. The beauty of premature burial as a murder method wasn't in its violence, but in its deniability. No blade, no bruises, just a misreading. A solemn nod from a priest, a grave dug just a little too early, and the earth does the rest. In some cases, the burial wasn't even staged. As death, it was framed as punishment. Certain feudal lords had the authority to dispense justice on their lands, and in times of rebellion or scandal, that justice could be brutal. There are fragmented accounts of peasants or minor nobles being sentenced to the earth, buried not because they were dead, but as a demonstration, a warning, a silencing. In one Moravian castle, a ledger describes 3 buried alive for treachery and fire, with no elaboration, no names, just a tally. You can imagine the moment, a pit dug not by grave diggers, but by soldiers, a prayer whispered only by the condemned, a shovelful of soil cast like a sentence. Even stranger, some cultures believed burial alive could purify the soul if endured, a kind of spiritual test. In certain monastic texts, references appear to anchorites who asked to be sealed into earth or stone, not in death, but in penance. But not all of them were volunteers. Some were sent there by order, disobedient monks, scandalous nuns. They were given water, maybe bread, and left to find holiness in the dark. Many never returned. Their holiness became legend. Their bodies became foundations. You, in your grave, were not sentenced, not in words, but perhaps someone somewhere meant for this to happen. Maybe not with malice, maybe just with convenience. Maybe you knew too much, or didn't matter enough, or stood in someone's way, and now, buried with prayers, your silence benefits them. One curious case in a small village near Vienna, local folklore tells of a widow who inherited her husband's property under suspicious terms. He died suddenly. She buried him quickly. Years later, the grave was disturbed during a flood, and the coffin was found split open from within. His jaw had snapped. His body had turned sideways. The widow, long dead herself, was remembered as generous, but the story became a cautionary tale, not about love, about timing. It's easy to forget, in our modern world of hospitals and paperwork, that the power to declare you dead once lay in the hands of those who might benefit from your absence. Death was not only medical, it was political, religious, personal, and when one person's breath threatened another's future, it could be taken without lifting a weapon just by assuming you'd stopped breathing. You think now of everyone who watched you die, the people who stood nearby, not seeing your fingers twitch, or seeing them and choosing not to speak, the ones who said nothing when you gasped, or called it a final exhale. You wonder who gained from your departure, who smiled at your burial, who crossed themselves with one hand while signing documents with the other. Your chest no longer rises. Your vision, if you still had it, would be black. But your story is not just about you. It's about all the others sent into the ground, not by death, but by decision, sealed beneath the soil for convenience, power, fear, or silence. And while you lie still now, you carry the weight of those stories. You're not just buried, you are erased. But history forgets imperfectly. Graves don't always stay shut, and bones, even decades later, sometimes speak. So you lie there, voiceless in the dark, and yet part of you wonders if silence is ever truly complete. Because in the centuries that follow, your fate and those like yours doesn't just linger in church archives or whispered village tales. It begins to shape stories, fiction, law, folklore. You become a metaphor, a warning, a curiosity. And for the first time, the horror of premature burial doesn't stay buried. It crawls up through literature, bleeds into medical journals, and starts to make people uncomfortable in a different way. Not as superstition, but as possibility. Your fingers, long since bone, scratched not at wood anymore, but at the walls of collective imagination. And now, finally, the world begins to listen, even if it's centuries too late. You begin to haunt not just graveyards, but books. In the 18th and 19th centuries, fear of being buried alive was no longer something whispered over a deathbed. It was a public obsession. Pamphlets, lectures, essays, all asking the same question: how do we know someone is truly dead? And behind every sentence, every printed diagram of a life-preserving coffin or vitality bell, is the echo of your story, of a life wrongly ended, too soon, too quietly. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe made premature burial a Gothic centerpiece. In The Premature Burial, Poe recounts tales almost too awful to believe, bodies discovered turned within their coffins, crypts opened to reveal desperate final gestures. And though his prose is dramatic, he was not exaggerating. He was responding to a very real, very widespread panic. This wasn't just fiction for the sake of thrills. It was rooted in reality. Newspapers reported on bodies exhumed with torn shrouds, splintered caskets, jaws frozen in agonized contortions. In Germany, a society was formed in 1772 called the Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial. Their goal to create protocols, systems, checks, bells above ground connected to strings, breathing tubes installed into select coffins, waiting morgues where corpses would lie for days, just in case. It was part medicine, part madness, and all fear. Your story had finally broken through, but not as you, as an idea. It became fashionable among the upper classes to write specific burial instructions in their wills. Do not bury me for 3 days. Stab my heart to make sure. Leave a mirror near my nose. Even doctors, those trained in the workings of the body, left such requests because they'd seen enough to know what can be missed. They knew that stillness is not death. They knew that a slow heart, a faint breath, can be misread, and misreading, when shovels are involved, is fatal. But not everyone believed. Historians still argue whether these fears were justified or merely the invention of overactive imaginations. Some claim it was mass hysteria, amplified by the printing press and Gothic fiction. Others point to hundreds of documented cases, anecdotal but persuasive. One surgeon in Vienna wrote of opening a coffin during a medical lecture, only to find scratch marks along the interior and blood under the fingernails. He fainted on the spot. His students fled. The report was never officially submitted. It was passed down as a rumor, but it stayed. Even as the world grew more scientific, the fear didn't fade. In 1837, a French doctor published On the Uncertainties of the Signs of Death, which cataloged cases of people declared dead only to wake hours or days later. It shook the medical community. It embarrassed it, but it also galvanized it. Procedures were rewritten, definitions debated, and yet no consensus truly emerged, because death, for all its finality, is maddeningly vague at the edges. Your heartbeat stops, but for how long? Your breath slows, but what if it returns? Is stillness enough? Is coldness? What about twitching, and who gets to decide? By the mid-19th century, waiting mortuaries had sprung up across Europe. In Munich, corpses were laid out in specially designed halls, each finger tied to a bell. Attendants sat nearby, watching, listening. And yes, sometimes the bells rang. Not often, but enough to justify the practice. A bell was heard in Dresden in 1861. The attendant rushed in. The body had moved. The woman lived another 4 years. Her name was never printed, but she proved the point burial could be a mistake, and for some, it was avoidable. One fringe account tells of a man in Prague who requested to be buried with a small vial of poison sewn into his sleeve. "If I wake and cannot escape," he wrote, "I would rather die on my own terms." His request was granted. No one knows if he ever needed it, but the fact that it was even imagined tells you everything. People weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of dying wrong. You, of course, had no such vial, no bell, no clause in your will. You were laid to rest because someone else decided you were done. But if you could speak now, you'd ask how many others were buried like me. How many stories were sealed in soil and never unearthed? And when did we decide that being wrong was better than being unsure? It's easy now, in a world of monitors and machines, to scoff at these fears, to imagine they belong to the past. But premature burial lingers in the corners of the modern mind. In anesthesia gone wrong, in coma patients misread, in those rare, terrifying cases where someone wakes in a morgue, cold and alone, banging until someone opens the drawer. Even today, errors happen, rarely, quietly, but enough. The fear has not died. It's been redesigned. We no longer build bells into coffins, but we build protocols, legal delays, medical reviews. We double-check, and sometimes that's enough. But the ghost of your story, your clawed hands, your final breath, your unheard screams still hovers, not to scare, but to remind. Because your death wasn't a tragedy born of horror. It was born of certainty, of people needing to know before they really did, of systems built to manage death, not listen to it, of procedures that left no room for doubt. And doubt, you now understand, might have saved you. In the literature that followed, you became everything, a symbol, a victim, a warning. Writers used your fate to frighten, yes, but also to protest, to question, to force readers and doctors and priests to think again. In that way, your burial was not final. It was foundational, a quiet, awful truth that pushed the world toward caution. But still, it wasn't you they remembered. It was the fear, the possibility, the image, the fiction, your name, your story, your final gasp. It was buried again, this time under words. But perhaps that's better than nothing. Perhaps a scream remembered, even if misattributed, is louder than one no one heard. You lie now in shadow, in pages, in old medical diagrams. Your fingers live in chalk lines, your story in candlelight, and somewhere, someone ties a thread to a bell and whispers, "Just in case." Time loses its grip now. You are no longer a body buried in haste, nor a footnote in the margins of a priest's ledger. You have become a caution etched into memory, a fear carried silently through generations like a genetic tremor. Still, your grave does not fade, not entirely, because while the centuries roll on and the rituals change, something of your story lingers, not only in ink and whispers, but in the very structures of law and medicine. The world that once rushed to bury you now hesitates slightly. It builds systems of delay, checks, balances, and protocols. It invents machines that beep and lights that blink, all to confirm what once was guessed. And though they don't know your name, they build these things in fear of it. They fear what happened to you might happen again, and in some dark, unspoken way, you have changed the world. By the late 19th century, the panic had begun to solidify into reform. Death, once pronounced by instinct or religious decree, became a process, a legal status. Countries instituted mandatory waiting periods before burial. Doctors were taught to recognize the difference between catalepsy and true death. The stethoscope, invented earlier in the century, became not just a tool of diagnosis, but of certainty. It allowed breath to be heard when it was too faint to see, hearts to be monitored when they whispered instead of thudded. It gave voice to the near-dead. It gave people like you a second chance, if only it had come sooner. Embalming gained popularity too, not just as a means of preservation, but as a method of confirmation. To embalm a body is to pierce, to drain, to fill. You cannot survive it. It is the modern world's brutal guarantee that no one wakes up in the ground. And though most accept it now as tradition, it was born, in part, from terror. The same terror that filled the lungs of those sealed too soon. The terror of waking up in a coffin, in a crypt, in a silence no prayer can end. Here's a curious detail. Even as science advanced, the fear didn't vanish. In 1896, a patent was filed in the United States for a coffin equipped with an electric alarm system. If the buried moved, they could trigger a bell, or even a flag. The inventor, a physician, claimed to have seen 3 people buried alive in his career. He never gave names. He never published proof. But the patent was granted. Others followed. Designs for escape hatches, spring-loaded lids, breathing tubes. The world had grown clever, but still nervous, still unsure. Because for all our progress, death remains stubbornly ambiguous at the edges. You might think the 20th century, with its hospitals and coroner reports, finally buried the fear for good, but not quite. In 1905 in South Carolina, a man named Essie Dunbar was declared dead after an epileptic seizure. She was buried quickly, too quickly. The next day, her sister arrived and demanded the grave be opened. It was, and Essie sat up. She lived another 47 years. The crowd at the reburial fled, screaming. The newspapers called it a miracle, but what it was a mistake. One they almost never discovered. One breath away from silence. One sister away from myth. Even today, rare stories surface. A man in Venezuela wakes inside a morgue freezer. A woman in Mississippi bangs on the inside of a body bag. A child in Kenya opens his eyes at his own funeral. Most of these people survive. Some don't. But their existence proves the point for all our tools, for all our learning. Death isn't always where we think it is. Historians now look back at medieval practices with both sympathy and horror. Sympathy, because they did what they could with what they knew. Horror, because what they knew was often wrong, but the consequences were always final. The church meant well. The physicians tried. The families grieved sincerely, but their faith in signs, the cooling of the skin, the stillness of the chest, the silence of the lips was often misplaced. And people like you paid for that certainty with lives that weren't quite finished. In law, the ambiguity of death still causes problems. In some countries, clinical death is defined by the cessation of heartbeat. In others, it's brain function. And in the gray between those definitions lies confusion, lawsuits, ethics boards, families who disagree about whether a loved one is gone or merely unreachable. And in that gray, your story stirs. One peculiar legacy, the practice of declaring time of death with certainty, even when uncertainty lingers. Why do we do this? Perhaps to comfort the living, to offer a timestamp for grief, to give the illusion that there was a clean break between life and what followed. But you know better. Death, like sleep, comes gradually sometimes, uneven, quiet. You drift and return, and sometimes the world assumes you stayed gone when you were only resting. Now think of this every time a monitor beeps flat in a hospital. A nurse leans close, they double check, they wait, just a moment longer. That moment brief, barely noticed, is your legacy. That breathless pause before the sheet is drawn. That second glance at the monitor. That flicker of doubt before the final pronouncement. That is where your scream, centuries late, is finally heard. You didn't die for nothing. You died for everyone after you. For every person whose pulse slowed instead of stopped. For every child who woke just in time. For every patient whose eyes fluttered when the nurse turned back. You And the thousands like you, forgotten, nameless, misburied, you taught the world to hesitate. They don't remember you, but they remember the fear, and fear, when used wisely, can become mercy. In literature, you became legend. In law, you became precedent. In medicine, you became reason. The reason to wait, to recheck, to question. That hesitation is your afterlife. That flicker of doubt, that twitch of conscience, is the space where you still exist. And maybe that's all you ever needed. Not rescue, not resurrection, just a moment longer. A voice that said, "Let's be sure." A hand that hesitated before the lid closed. A pause before the earth took its breath and buried yours with it. You may be gone, your grave long lost, your bones dissolved into the dust of forgotten cemeteries and flattened churchyards. But the silence you left behind has grown louder than any bell. It tolls in emergency rooms. It whispers in the minds of tired doctors and late-shift morticians. It reminds the world that stillness is not always surrender, and that sometimes, even in the quietest moment, life waits for one last chance to be seen. And now, as the soil presses its final silence into what remains of you, the story drifts toward its ending, not just your ending, but the quiet fading of an era that could not tell the difference between sleep and death, between stillness and surrender. You were once one of many, buried too soon in a world too certain. You were surrounded by ritual but denied caution, wrapped in piety but not in care. But with time, that blind confidence began to soften, slowly, unevenly. The world didn't stop burying people, but it started to ask questions first, and the fear that once sealed your coffin began to open new doors, not to resurrection, but to reform. The modern age arrived with wires and blinking lights, with machines that could watch over the dying better than any priest or grieving family ever could. Electrocardiograms, oxygen monitors, flat lines that draw a perfect tragic plateau across a screen. Death became data. Loss became a graph. But in the background of every beep, your story still lingers, because the world may have learned to count the final seconds more precisely, but it also remembers what happens when it assumes too quickly. Protocols were written, hospitals trained their staff to wait. 3 minutes, 5 minutes. Always be sure. They don't say your name in those moments, but that caution is yours. It is the distant echo of your last twitch beneath the soil. In some countries now, bodies are no longer buried for at least 24 hours, not because of law, but because of legacy. Waiting has become an act of mercy. Time has become a safeguard, and while those who benefit may never know it, they inherit that grace from you, from all the others who weren't quite dead, just misread. The fear that once locked you into a coffin now opens time for others to survive. And that is not justice, but it is something. Historians look back on the medieval centuries with a mixture of horror and pity. It is easy to mock a world without monitors, without forensics, without understanding. But when you look closely, there is also tragedy there. People were doing their best, sometimes sincerely, sometimes indifferently, but almost always with less than they needed. The priest with trembling hands, the village healer with herbs but no answers, the gravedigger counting coins instead of breaths. None of them meant to send you into the ground while you still had time. But meaning has never been enough, and you, more than anyone, learned what happens when certainty stands in for truth. Your death was a whisper, not a cry, a pause, not a finale. And in that quiet, something shifted. The world began to suspect that death might not be so tidy, might not always arrive with clarity, might sometimes slip through the cracks, unnoticed. The fear of premature burial didn't end with a cure. It ended with a question, what if we're wrong? And so that question echoed into courtrooms, into hospital boards, into literature and law and the minds of inventors who dreamed up coffins that could call for help, morgues with glass lids, body bags that opened from the inside, overkill perhaps. But in that excess was an apology, an unspoken one, but real. The world was saying, without saying, we failed you, and we're trying not to fail the next. A quirky footnote even now. Some people choose to be buried with a cell phone. not out of superstition, just in case. Maybe it's symbolic. Maybe it's one last tether to the world. But maybe, deep down, we still remember what it felt like to wake beneath the earth, even if we never lived it, even if we only inherited the dread. So now the world moves slower around death. It does not always help. Mistakes still happen. People still die before they're ready. And sometimes, just like before, they're sent off with too little thought. But the difference is this: someone always hesitates. Someone always asks, "Are we sure?" And that moment is yours. That flicker of doubt, that glance back before the grave is closed, is the place where your story lives. You were not just a victim of ignorance. You were a turning point, a warning. And even if your bones were never recovered, your truth remained. It remains in every medical student who learns to double check, in every family that insists on waiting a little longer, in every nurse who stands silently beside a monitor, watching not for absence, but for return. And now your breath, long gone, becomes part of something larger. It is not resurrection. It is resonance. You are the faint vibration behind the caution, the pause before the pronouncement, the moment before the lid is nailed shut. You were buried alive, yes, but not forgotten. And so, your story closes not with vengeance, not with justice, but with a kind of quiet redemption, a slow, patient shift in how the world says goodbye. And maybe that's all you ever needed. Not a miracle, not rescue, just time. Just someone to listen a little longer. Just the grace of being doubted when everyone else was so sure. And now the grave settles. The world softens. The silence remains, but it is no longer empty. Let your breath fall slower now. The story has finished, but it doesn't vanish. It lingers, gently, like dust in old sunlight, like echoes across stone. The horror has passed, but not without leaving something behind. A stillness, a hush, a knowing. You've walked through centuries of shadow, through cold earth and forgotten names. You've seen how death, once assumed, can be mistaken, how fear can become law, and how mercy can arrive too late. And now, you're back, above the ground, beneath the blanket, listening to the quiet that follows truth. There's no need to fear it now. That fear belonged to another time, a time that no longer controls you. The world has changed. You are safe. You are heard. You are breathing. Let the silence feel soft again, not suffocating. Let the dark become comfort, not confinement. You've stayed awake long enough to remember why we wait, why we whisper, why we ask twice. Now let your body be still, not from fear, but from peace. Let each breath be a soft step away from the voices, from the graves, from the bells and the scratching. They cannot reach you here, not anymore. Just the hum of the room, the rhythm of your chest, the sound of a world that's learned to be careful.